Hello, hello. This is the My Artifact episode number 3727. Today's date is November 27, 2025. It's been almost like morning at 8:34 a.m. All right, let's just jump into the question. Let's go. All right, the question is, what if art funded scientific breakthroughs? Art funded scientific breakthroughs. Okay, this question is little bit something different. I didn't really expect that, but still. Okay, first of all, what exactly is this question and why am I asking this question to myself? This is what if question. Why am I asking this question to myself? What if question is always the really interested way to give the answer. It kind of like a force you to think about that reality. And when I try to think about that reality, or when I try to create that reality, I'm kind of like utilizing my knowledge and experience that I have been through and kind of like explain from my point of perspective. It's not a kind of like a typical question where what is actually 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. No, it's not a kind of like a simply the answer is stagnant. It's a kind of like a question is like that ki why 1 plus 3 is not 7. So basically, when you ask this question, you are kind of like simply think about what is actually meaning of 1, what is the meaning of 3, what is the meaning of plus, what is the meaning of equal to. And when you would kind of like ask this question for this particular symbols and numbers and things like that, you just understand more regarding about not only the answer but as also kind of like what is actually behind the scientific function for this number, what is actually meaning of this number, what is actually meaning of this plus and sign and things like that. It is that. And that's why I'm kind of like somebody, this what if question is somewhat something really interested way. It's become a little bit interesting to kind of like give the answer. Disclaimer: the information that I'm trying to tell you is not exactly right or it's not exactly wrong either. It's raw, it's unfiltered, it's kind of like simply my opinion. So do not believe in any kind of like information that I'm saying, or do not seek for any kind of like information that I'm saying. It's just my opinion, and opinion are subjective. All right, now should we jump to the question? All right, now the question is that what if art funded through scientific breakthroughs? Like basically this question suggests that like basically is this thing, a art can be funded on scientific progress. Like can be art would be funded to the scientific thing. Like okay, if you still not really understand, I am still not really understand too, but I'm trying to simplify as possible way. A science, if you wanted to develop the science is not a kind of like a thing that a telescope is a science, or kind of like Hubble telescope or things or that. Like basically every innovations or every kind of like invention doesn't really happen by itself. No, it takes time, it takes effort, and another thing, it takes money. Yeah. Why? What is actually money? Why is that money? Okay, let me give you the perspective. I built the telescope. Now this telescope has a feature that it can kind of like see beyond the object. Like basically is this thing that if I like this telescope is a kind of like a see that it can see through. Okay, it can see through this telescope. Now which is really good, which is really great. Okay, yeah. But there is a problem is that I wanted to utilize this telescope into the space. Like basically is this thing, I want to utilize this telescope mechanism into the space. So if I wanted to do this thing, I need to kind of like upgrade my telescope in kind of like a much more better way. Kind of like simply make sure that it kind of like a really good in everything. It kind of like a purpose the kind of like a things invented, like basically it can see through and things and that. Okay, yeah. Now for this particular purpose, it's not kind of like my telescope is just like a 10-inch of kind of like a telescope. But if I wanted to make the telescope like exact same telescope for the kind of like see the planets and things, and which can kind of like orbit around the earth and things like that, then probably I need a kind of like assembly entire team to kind of like make this telescope in like basically it's not the kind of like simply typical the telescope that you kind of like see and things like that. Like it's a kind of like a telescope that kind of like is mounted on the space. Okay, yeah. So for that particular purpose, you need a research. You need not only research, but as also kind of like you need to develop that particular mechanism to kind of like the how your telescope is actually work and things and that. Now for that particular thing, for that particular research and things like that, what is actually really required? Money, right? Like basically you need a higher kind of like a scientific scientist, you need to hire kind of like a physicist, you need to hire kind of like a lot of people. Okay, and for that particular thing you need a money. Now basically where is this money came from? Okay, so basically this thing you have to go to kind of like any investor or any kind of like a organization that you says that this is the kind of like a telescope that I invented, which can see through and things and that. So I wanted to kind of like install this telescope into the space because it kind of like adds so much value in the space research and things and that. So for that particular purpose I wanted to build that telescope for the space, so I need money, so can you give me money? Okay, you kind of like saying this thing to the investor or things or that. Now some investor kind of like some believe or things like that, but some people did not, because it is too much amount of money. Okay, like basically there are a lot of amount of money. Like basically if I wanted to kind of like include anything regarding about space, probably its price is almost like a 10 time higher regarding about every component and things and that. Okay, and I need money, and if I didn't get money, how do I supposed to my scientific discoveries or scientific innovation kind of like implement on the real life? It does not. Okay, so funding is somewhat something really essential. If I didn't get funding, nothing really happened. Okay, no one born as a rich, nothing really at all. Okay, so what exactly is this thing? Okay, how do I supposed to kind of like assembly give them such a kind of like assembly organization to a funding so that they would kind of like develop that particular stuff? Well, the question suggests art form. Okay, what is exactly art form? Art form means like that a painting, like basically is this thing. What is actually most valuable thing? Okay, that you can carry. Like most of people say gold, most of people say diamond, most of people say kind of like assembly that kind of like a credit card or things. So like basically kind of like people says that another kind of like a material things like that. But still, if I'm gonna say, it does not hold that much amount of value. Okay, like what I'm trying to tell you is this thing. A painting is such a commodity where it can hold millions of amounts of money. A simple painting, let's just say kind of like assembly 2 feet of canvas painting, which kind of like a drawn by the kind of like a really famous painter and things like that, easily that painting would kind of like a takes almost like a millions of dollars. And this is kind of like a really too much amount of money. That is a too much amount of money. Okay, now another thing is that ki a painting has its whole kind of like a significant amount of money, even if that painting is kind of like a painted by any kind of like a random painter. Okay, but the painting is kind of like a really good in every possible perspective, then that painting is actually sold in kind of like a very big amount of money. That is true, that is actually happened. Okay, but you have to kind of like make sure your painting is kind of like a really good, really great, regarding about every possible perspective. It should supposed to be showcase that particular message through the painting. It can like basically that painting should supposed to be good. Okay, I don't know how do I supposed to mention now what is actually meaning of good, but it should supposed to be good. Okay, now when it kind of like is really good, it holds some sort of amount of money. Okay, now that painting, usually painting are kind of like a somebody sell or auction. Okay, by the rich people. Okay, now what does exactly painting do? Okay, what does exactly painting do? Like basically if I made a painting which is kind of like really good, really great, really amazing things like that. Okay, and I kind of like sell this kind of like a painting into the auction and things like that, and another kind of like a rich person buy my painting for, let's just say, almost like a $2 million. Okay, $2 million he buy my painting. Now basically I get $2 million, not exactly $2 million, like after taxes I get almost like a $1.7 million. Okay, but I get significant amount of money, and that particular person who gets my painting. Okay, now what does that painting will gonna do? That painting will kind of like serve the only one purpose, to kind of like somebody shine up his house and things like that. He might kind of like hang this painting into the kind of like somebody, let's just say, in wall or things like that. Right, yeah, and that's it. That's the only purpose of painting that serve and things like that. Okay, so what exactly is this thing? Does it kind of like add any value to the society and things like that? No, nothing really at all. Art form, painting art form is kind of like a really good art form, really great, really amazing. Okay, and it does not serve any kind of like only purpose to the kind of like a in a society and things like that. So that's why this question is actually arise, that what if art form will kind of like a simply give the funding to the scientific research. Example is this thing, let's just say that key, I built this painting, I sold this painting the $2 million. Instead of kind of like a simply I kind of like a take, let's just say kind of like a $0.2 million to myself, and rest of the 1.5 million dollar I kind of like a give to that particular scientific research where who is actually wanted to build that telescope and things like that. Okay, yeah. And if I do that thing, then my art form are kind of like a simply promoting or kind of like a funding a scientific research. Okay, yeah. And which is really good. $1.5 million for the scientific discoveries for this building this telescope. It would be really good. It's not kind of like a completely kind of like a solve all the funding things, but it kind of like a somewhat something solve some sort of funding things. $1.5 million is kind of like it's a very big amount of money. Okay, and which kind of like a somewhat something add value to that telescope and things like that. And if this thing happens, scientific like kind of like a art form, like my painting is kind of like a serve something to the society, serve something good in the society. And this is what kind of like question is actually arise, that what if a kind of like a art form are kind of like a funded the scientific discoveries or things like that. Now how is exactly happened, like basically is this thing, would you like you actually kind of like put a lot of effort to build that painting and things like that, and you are actually selling this painting, like basically it's your loss na. Okay, if you are kind of like a doing this thing for humanity good purposes, okay, that is okay, but not every people are kind of like that. Okay, yeah, let's just say I'm putting a lot of effort to build that painting. It took me almost like a year to make a painting, and I'm actually earning almost like a $2 million. Why would I supposed to be share my money to that particular scientific discoveries and things like that? I am not a scientist. I don't really have that much gravity regarding about that telescope and what will kind of like do and things like that. So why would I supposed to do this thing? Yeah, it's my personal choice. Now I put a lot of effort to build that painting, so I would supposed to be take that money for myself, right? Why would I supposed to be kind of like a take, kind of like a send this money to someone else and things and that? Okay, so that is not okay. Yeah, so basically it's this thing. That's why. But this is kind of like a small individual perspective. I kind of like a tell this point of I'm just kind of like a solving this particular problem with a kind of like a simply single point of perspective, or kind of like a simply single person point of perspective. Oh yeah. Now imagine. Okay, yeah. I'm trying to imagine a particular context. Okay, yeah. Let's just say there is a kind of like a simply scientific society. Okay, yeah. Scientific society, a kind of like a, let's just say a group of club. Okay, who are associated with the science. Okay, yeah. Now basically is this thing that what does they do is that they have kind of like a, let's just say hundreds of painter in their club. Okay, yeah. Now they have only one job to do. Okay, yeah. They have to make a painting as good as possible as it can. So those 100 painters are kind of like a doing the painting regarding about the kind of like something as good as possible as it can. Okay, yeah. Now basically is this thing that kind of like a club. Okay, that club is kind of like a simply serve one purposes. What exactly that purposes? Okay, the painter who kind of like a paint that painting is not associate or not kind of like a completely owner. The painter is not completely owner. The club is the owner. Okay, but how, like basically that particular painting is actually painted by that painter. Okay, yeah. So how that particular club will be a owner? Okay, let me give you perspective. A club is kind of like a simply owner is because of that club is kind of like a providing everything to make the painting, but that is not that expensive. Like basically what do I really require to kind of like a make a painting? A canvas, a kind of like a simply a kind of like a paint, which are kind of like a far more cheaper. Okay, if I kind of like simply want any kind of like organic paint or things like that, it's also really not that cheap. Probably you would get almost like in $100 you will get everything regarding about how big is your canvas and things and that. It's not really that much big thing. Okay, yeah. So like basically what exactly is this thing, like how does it kind of like that particular club will kind of like serve the society, like basically what kind of like they are kind of like offering value to the painter. Okay, yeah. In painting, okay, yeah, a painter can paint painting. Okay, yeah, but not all the painting are kind of like a went into the $2 million and things like that. Basically is this thing, a painter kind of like put lot of efforts and things and that, but still almost like a decade there is no painting would kind of like sell that much, and there is only one painting would sell so much bigger. So what exactly is this thing now? Okay, yeah, a kind of like a simply really good painting is not kind of like a simply he just develop every single year. No, definitely not. Okay, it takes so much amount of time, effort, refinement, make it their painting is as much as better and things like that. Okay, even after if it does, there is no kind of like a somebody guarantee that particular painting will kind of like a somebody give the kind of like a somebody kind of like a sell this thing or that. Nothing really at all. Okay, one thing. So this is kind of like a problem that it get. So what does it kind of like that scientific club will kind of like do is that he basically is this thing that scientific club is kind of like somebody promoting that painting, that painter to do painting, even if they are not earning that much amount of money from the painting, but still that scientific club are kind of like a giving them offer amount of money regarding about that they should supposed to be kind of like a something that even if you're not getting any kind of like a money from your painting, still we are kind of like giving you some sort of amount of salary at every month and things like that. So this is kind of like a something the club is kind of like offering them a kind of like a stability to do a painting. Okay, yeah. So that painter who kind of like a do the painting. Okay, do the painting. Now basically that painter is kind of like a do the painting. Then what exactly is this thing that that if that particular in 100 out of one painter kind of like a make a kind of like a really good painting, that painting would kind of like a sell in auction, let's just say $2 million. Okay, yeah. What is actually happened that in the $2 million, let's just say 20% will went to the painter. Okay, yeah. So 20% kind of like a went into the painter, and then kind of like 80% of the contribution of that painting went into that particular society, that club. Okay, 80% of the fund, and that scientific club are kind of like a somebody giving that particular amount of money. Let's just say they kind of like a cut. Let's just say kind of like a somebody. Let's just say 20% they kind of like a take, and let's just say 50%. Okay, 50 or 60% of that particular painting value would should supposed to be kind of like a do the kind of like a somebody for the scientific contribution, things like that. When this kind of like a somebody particular system that we created, so in that particular in this particular system there is a kind of like a somebody the guarantee for everybody. Okay, yeah. What is exactly everybody for guarantee? Okay, yeah. As a for the scientific discovery, every year every year that scientific club is kind of like a giving particular money to the scientific discovery every year, because they have hundreds of painters, and every painter in kind of like a one of them painter kind of like a one painting kind of like a really good, and that painting might gonna sell to the $1 million or $2 million and things and that. Okay, yeah. So because of this thing, that particular club is kind of like a somebody generate some sort of amount of revenue, and some that particular amount of revenue, 60% of the revenue, like basically 60% of the revenue takes the kind of like a scientific discovery, 40% revenue for them. And yeah, this is what kind of like a things is actually happened. Like basically when this happened, the scientific club is really happy, scientific discovery is also really happy, the painter is also really happy because he is also getting the paid, he also getting the salary, as well as he also getting his painting for 20%. Okay, yeah. And as well as plus the salary and royalty, he is also getting that too. Okay, yeah. And this is when everyone actually happy. Painter is actually happy, the scientific club is also happy, the scientific discovery is also really happy too. And this is kind of like a cycle every single year. Every single year they are kind of like making really good painting, and they are kind of like earning some sort of amount of money. And when this thing actually happened, the art form, those 100 painters are kind of like a do the painting, that art form are kind of like a serve the kind of like a some sort of process, so serve the kind of like a some perspective in the society to kind of like build the technology for better humanity and things and that. Now which is really good. Yeah, it's somewhat something, this is kind of like a somewhat something look like a really good idea, but still it's not. Okay, why it's not, why it's not really that thing. Okay, first of all, okay, a painting is an art form. Okay, yeah. Music or any kind of, it's an art form. Okay, yeah. And basically art form is only and only established when it has a freedom. Okay, yeah. Like basically is this thing, have you ever kind of like a notice that basically is this thing, a kind of like a good creator who doesn't really put that much amount of kind of like effort to build that particular kind of like art form. Okay, yeah. basically is this thing that art form is kind of like a somebody always really good when it have freedom. Example, okay, when this particular club has a kind of like a somebody only have one purpose to kind of like a somebody is this thing to kind of like a give some sort of amount of money to the scientific discoveries and things and that. So basically is this thing that club are kind of like something like forcing painter to paint every single year. And this is where kind of like a problem it occurred. Because of that, let's just say there is a one painter who doesn't really want to paint. Like he just wanted to take a vacation, or he just wanted to take this thing, or he doesn't really have that much kind of like ambitions and things like that. And still that particular person, because of that particular club, is actually forcing them to kind of like do the painting. That painting doesn't really have that charm. That doesn't really have that kind of like a spark and things like that. Let me give you perspective. Painting is not just a painting. A photo is a photo, but a painting is a very different thing. Okay, let me give you perspective. Let me understand what exactly is this thing. When you took a photo, you take a photo of kind of like let's just say you have a camera, let's just say you have a phone, you take a photo with a flat surfaces. Okay, let me understand. Let me what exactly is this thing. You take a photo, let's just say you have a kind of like a really good camera, let's just say you have an iPhone camera, you kind of like suddenly there is a kind of like a person in front of you, and you kind of like went to the portrait and kind of like click the portrait. Now that photo is really good, really great. Okay, yeah, in that particular photo that person is look really good, the background is look really good, everything is look really good. Okay, yeah. Now this is what kind of like assembly predictable. Okay, yeah. Like basically you predicted that photo shoot supposed to be good, and that camera kind of like a take the photo shoot supposed to be good, and it take a really good photo. Okay, yeah. So it's good, it's great. Okay, yeah. Like it's right, but it kind of like lose the kind of like a value of effort. Okay, yeah. What is the difference between the photo and what is the difference between the painting? Okay, yeah. A painting has its own creative thing. A photo has its own creative thing. While you're taking photo, you are kind of like a somebody do lot of kind of like a somebody things regarding about that key composition. How should you supposed to place your subject on which kind of like a frame? What is actually background? What is actually is this thing and that. But even after you all this thing, you didn't really have that much flexibility to do a creativity in the photo in a photography. You can change the you can change the kind of like a composition, you can change the background and things and that, but still you didn't really have that much flexibility in the photography. No, nothing really at all. Okay, yeah. But in a painting, you have complete flexibility regarding about what can you do, you can make that thing. Okay, yeah. Because painting is associated with your mind, it's associated with what is exactly that you wanted to kind of like a make, and which is something like a really crazy. Okay, yeah, really crazy. Let me give you the another. Leonardo da Vinci, who kind of like a painting, A Last Supper. A Last Supper painting is actually about a kind of like a Jesus who have a kind of like a somebody have a last meal to his kind of like a colleague and things like that. Look at that painting. When you see that painting, that is not exactly happened, by the way. Like basically in the Bible story, they have kind of like a last supper. Last supper means like that a last meal. Okay, like basically then after that the Jesus is actually hang in things and that and yeah. But like this kind of like a last supper is kind of like a represent that last meal and things like that. Okay, now basically is it actually happen in the Bible? Is it actually happen in real world? Which it actually happen in kind of like with the Jesus and things like that? I'm not really sure and things like that. Okay, but the way that the painting is actually described that particular event, I'm not really sure is it actually happen or not, but because of this painting, most of people actually believe that this would be happen. Okay, Last Supper, and they kind of like somebody try to resonate what would be that particular stuff. Now that particular painting is really good. Look at the background, look at the Jesus, look at the kind of like a Mary Magdalene. By the way, I'm not really sure is that Mary Magdalene or not. Okay, who is Mary Magdalene? Also, I'm not really sure, but I think I'm not really sure. I just kind of like heard from a lot of kind of like some YouTube videos and things like that. Mary Magdalene is a girlfriend of Jesus. Probably. Don't blame me. Okay, I just heard. Okay, whatever. So this painting is kind of like a really good. Okay, regarding about every possible perspective. That creativity is only and only established by the painting. Because when you try to do a paint, you have flexibility regarding about you can do anything with your brush stroke and things and that. You just have to kind of like a blend with your imagination, with kind of like a some observation, and kind of like a replicate that through. That's something really great. That's something that can just wow. Okay, yeah. Like basically, when you took the photo, you can, even if you didn't really see the photo, you can predict the photo, what kind of like a photo should supposed to be look. But the painting is not. Like basically is this thing, you kind of like simply sit in front of that painter for almost like a 2 hour, and you still not really sure that how that particular painter kind of like a paint your painting, because it's a very creative art form. You can do a lot of creativity in the painting. That's why, okay, let me tell you one thing. That's flexibility is actually came from the painter perspective. Okay, yeah. If that particular painter is really good at painting, really good at kind of like so many things and that, okay, yeah, that particular person, that particular painter would kind of like somebody paint that particular painting in that way. For that particular purpose, a painter should supposed to be kind of like a somebody feel free regarding what he think and that and that. Now, if that particular painter didn't really feel free to kind of like make that painting, then that painting will not gonna serve that particular purpose. Nothing really at all. It's not a kind of like a somebody filling the kind of like a canvas with the paint and things like that. No, nothing at all. A painting is a very, very different creative platform. Very different creative platform. And it's that's why it's kind of like something hold its value. That's why kind of like a painting kind of like a sell millions of dollars for that particular purpose. Okay, yeah. So when that particular scientific club is actually force painter to kind of like a paint the painting every single year, even if they are kind of like a forcing little less, but still it's kind of like a lose the value of freedom. And when it kind of like lose the value of freedom, then probably the painting is not kind of like a serve the kind of like a simply the proper fulfillment of a kind of like a freedom and things like that. World famous painting Mona Lisa, how much time, like just imagine like how much time does it take for Mona Lisa to complete? Okay, yeah. And by the way, that painting was kind of like a paint by the Leonardo da Vinci. How much? Like guess the time. Fucking 14 year, dude. I'm not really sure, but more than 10 year probably, yeah. More than 10 year really required to kind of like make the Mona Lisa painting. 10 year to make the painting. So basically, you do understand how much kind of like some gravity that they put. Okay, yeah. So it is that. So a kind of like a feel free is really essential for painter. It's not really that key, like a basically is this thing that key you just have to kind of like simply be careless regarding about when you want to do and things like that. Another thing is that na key, if your only purpose for scientific discoveries, then your painting are kind of like simply resonate only one thing regarding about scientific discovery. There are multiples of kind of like simply cultures and things like that. Those are not associated with scientific discovery, like some sort of traditional culture and things and that. And there is a lot of stuff. So, but like this is the kind of like some way that art might be funded through the scientific breakthrough, in my point of perspective, probably. Okay, yeah. There are also another way to like art is not just kind of like a painting. Like there are multiple ways to kind of like do the things. Okay, yeah. But still, okay, yeah. Art form or sorry, scientific breakthroughs are kind of like something depend on funding and things like that. Yes, that is true. But it's not kind of like only associate or only rely on art form. Okay, yeah. We have kind of like an investor who are kind of like really good at investing money on some certain thing. There are so many people are really good people. They are kind of like wanted to invest on scientific discoveries. Yeah, you need to find that thing and you need to get that thing. Yes, art form is a kind of like some way to kind of like some funding on scientific breakthrough, but still it's not a kind of like a completely entire answer. And as also is this thing, it's not really fully established yet too. Okay, yeah. So yes, and also another thing is that now when you try to innovate anything, there is a lot of resistance will gonna happen. Funding research will definitely will gonna happen, and that is true because it kind of like somebody make your product refine as much as you think it is. Because let me tell you one thing now, if you think is that if you wanted to invent something and that invention cost you so much amount of money, then you're gonna make sure that how should I supposed to make sure that I invent that thing with little less amount of money. And this is also gonna have possible. Okay, let me give you another perspective. Is this thing belong to the India. And in India we have same point of perspective, is that key. We also have kind of like a jugad. Let me tell you one thing, we don't really have that much amount of money. We are not kind of like spending almost like millions and billions of dollars for kind of like innovations and things and that, because we don't really have that much amount of money. How should we supposed to kind of like simply fund on that particular scientific breakthrough? Nothing really at all. So we kind of like develop that such a mindset that whatever the money that we have, we kind of like utilize that money to kind of like simply innovate that particular stuff. So we kind of like change the innovation perspective to kind of like simply regarding about funding that I get, not kind of like simply getting the full funding. Kind of like simply we change our innovation regarding about whatever the funding that we get. And because of this thing, we are kind of like simply tweaking something to kind of like simply how do we supposed to make the innovation as good as possible as it can, but still with with kind of like with the funding that I have. So yeah, and that's why because of this thing, the ISRO actually kind of like a space research who kind of like simply send the Mars orbiter mission with a very less amount of prices. Like let me give you another perspective. Is this thing that the Martian movie, okay, yeah, Martian movie, Hollywood Martian movie, which is kind of like simply even more higher budget than our entire space mission. Okay, yeah. So this is what it is. Okay, yeah. So let me tell you one thing, a scientific discoveries or scientific breakthrough, yes, it really required funding and things like that, but you have to change the perspective. Innovation will gonna happen with a little less amount of money too. Okay, yeah. And yeah, it kind of like it takes a lot of kind of like assembly guts and kind of like a problem and things like that, but this is what kind of like assembly the journey of innovations and creativity probably. All right. And another thing is that painting or painter or any other art form are kind of like simply if you tied in one thing, then probably that art form will kind of like lose its sense, I think. Okay, yeah, but probably I'm not exactly right. But sometimes consistency is also really matter too. Whatever, there are kind of like multiple things. Sometimes it's wrong, sometimes it's right. Whatever. This is it. And thank you.